I never thought much of it when I bought that house. Honestly, I was more excited about leaving the city behind than I was about the place itself. I'd been living in the heart of Chicago for years, barely scraping by. Rent was high, work was draining, and I'd lost touch with almost everyone I knew. So when I found this old farmhouse on the outskirts of a tiny town called Dustwood, tucked away on the edge of nowhere, it felt like a second chance. The house was a bit rundown, sure. It had that smell, dusty, musty, like nobody had lived there in a while. But there was something about it that felt right. It was isolated, quiet, and I figured I could spend my days in peace, away from the noise of the city. No more phone calls, no more emails, no more distractions. I was eager to disconnect from everything, find some space to think. The world seemed so overwhelming back then, and this old house, with its crooked windows and sagging porch, seemed like a perfect escape. I packed up my few belongings, books, clothes, a few kitchen utensils, and made the 3-hour drive to the house. The last few miles were along a winding dirt road that seemed to stretch on forever, surrounded by dense trees and fields. It felt like I was heading into some forgotten part of the country, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The house itself sat at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. It was a 2-story structure, with peeling paint and an old, rusted fence that separated the property from the fields beyond. The land stretched out in all directions, dotted with weeds and dry grass. It felt desolate, but in a strange way, that was part of its charm. I didn't mind the isolation, I embraced it. The first night there was calm. I made myself a simple dinner, unpacked what I needed, and settled into the living room with a book. There was no TV, no internet, no signal from my phone, just the sounds of the wind rustling outside and the occasional creak of the house settling. It was peaceful. It felt like I was truly alone for the first time in years. But that peace didn't last long. On the second night, around midnight, I was sitting in the same spot, reading a book by the dim light of a lamp, when I heard it. A faint noise, like the rustling of leaves or the soft crunch of footsteps on dry grass. I glanced up, thinking it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer wandering near the house. But when I looked out the window, I didn't see anything. Just the dark expanse of the field stretching out in front of me. I shrugged it off, convinced I'd imagined it. But then, a few minutes later, I heard it again, louder this time. This time, it sounded more deliberate, like something or someone was moving outside. My heart began to race. I wasn't sure what to think, but something about it made my skin crawl. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling aside the curtains to peer outside. In the middle of the field, standing tall and still, was what appeared to be a scarecrow. It hadn't been there earlier, at least I didn't think it had. I would have noticed it, right? I hadn't seen anyone out there, and I'd walked around the property earlier, checking for anything unusual. But there it was, in the distance, unmoving. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out if it was just some random thing left out in the field. It was too dark to see any details from this distance, but it stood out like a shadow against the moonlit grass. My gut twisted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was wrong. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just tired or paranoid. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the sound of rustling outside would pull me back to consciousness. I kept imagining that the scarecrow was moving, getting closer. And when I did manage to fall asleep, I dreamed of it, standing there, watching me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. The next day was uneventful. I spent the morning cleaning the house and sorting through boxes. The sound of the wind outside was the only thing breaking the silence. When evening came, I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. But when night fell, I couldn't help myself. I decided to take a look outside again, just to reassure myself that everything was fine. But when I looked out the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Another scarecrow. It wasn't in the same spot as the first one, but it was close, much closer. Standing a few yards from the first one, its features now clearly visible in the moonlight. And just like the first, it was completely still. But what caught my eye, what made my stomach drop, was the dress it wore. The torn, faded dress that hung loosely from the frame of the scarecrow. It looked exactly like the dress I had left hanging on the clothesline earlier that afternoon. The one I had worn the day before, the one that had gotten a little too dirty while I was unpacking. I tried to shake the thought from my mind. It was just a coincidence, right? The wind must have blown it off the line, and someone, maybe the previous owner or a neighbor, must have put it there to dry out. But it felt off, like everything about the situation was wrong. Why hadn't I noticed the first scarecrow the night before? How had it gotten there? I stayed at the window for what felt like hours, watching the two figures in the field. The rustling sound came again, but this time it seemed louder, almost like footsteps. I couldn't tell if they were real or just my imagination, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't alone out here. I had every intention of going to bed that night, but sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, the sounds outside would start again, creeping through the walls, filling my ears with the rustle of dry grass and the unsettling crack of movement. I got up again, this time determined to see what was going on. The house was eerily silent, save for my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. I crept toward the window, my heart hammering in my chest, and pulled the curtain back. The scarecrows were gone. But what replaced them was even worse. Both of them were now headless. The empty, hollow necks gaped at me from the darkness, and the one closest to the house had moved even closer. It stood just at the edge of the porch, its twisted body half hidden in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. Then I saw something that made my skin crawl. There was a third scarecrow, standing in the field near the others. But this one wasn't like the others. It wasn't just a figure, it was moving. Slowly, steadily, it was coming closer, its arms jerking at unnatural angles. I couldn't look away, my mind screaming at me to run, to do something, but I was frozen in place, rooted to the spot by fear. It was coming straight for me. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. I ran to the door, threw it open, and bolted out into the night, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The wind whipped past me, and I could feel the darkness closing in. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, parked at the end of the driveway. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped off down the dirt road without looking back. I drove for what felt like hours, not stopping until I reached the nearest town, 5 miles away. The night was silent except for the sound of my car's engine and the pounding in my chest. I never went back to that house. I couldn't. The images of the scarecrows, the way they seemed to move and watch me, are burned into my memory. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm alone, wondering what would have happened if I had stayed that last night. But I'll never know. And I don't want to. When I was about 15, my family and I lived in a small, quiet town nestled in the northern hills of Maine. The house we rented wasn't anything extraordinary, just your typical two-story with peeling paint, an old picket fence, and a creaky front porch that had seen better days. But it was home, and for 8 years, we filled it with memories, laughter, and even some minor heartbreak. My parents, my younger sister Sophie, and I all called it ours. However, nothing ever prepared us for what happened on the last day we spent there. It was around mid-October, the air just beginning to bite with the chill of approaching winter. We were moving to a larger place in town since Dad had landed a better job and we'd finally saved enough to afford something with a bit more space. I remember being both excited and a little sad about leaving. It was strange to imagine not waking up in that house again, or hearing the familiar creaks and groans in the walls as the wind blew through the night. Moving day arrived, and it was chaotic. Boxes stacked up everywhere, furniture wrapped in plastic, and the overwhelming scent of packing tape filled the air. By noon, the house was almost empty, with just a few stray items left scattered around, mostly things we weren't planning on taking with us. When the time came to load up the last of the boxes, we realized there wasn't enough room in the moving truck. My dad, ever the planner, insisted we could come back for the remaining items later that evening. My mom agreed, but they needed to drop off the bulk of the stuff first. That's how I ended up alone in the house for a few hours. They promised they'd be back by sunset, and since it was barely 3 in the afternoon, I figured I had plenty of time to finish up any last-minute tidying. The house was so empty, it felt surreal. The walls echoed slightly when I moved, and every little noise seemed to amplify in the hollow rooms. I busied myself checking closets and cabinets, making sure we hadn't forgotten anything. After about an hour, I found myself back in my old bedroom. It looked almost eerie, stripped of everything I'd filled it with over the years, my posters, books, and knickknacks. Against one wall stood an old wooden wardrobe. This thing was ancient, having come with the house when we first moved in. We'd kept it mostly as a curiosity piece. It was too heavy to move and had a musty smell that made storing anything inside unpleasant. It hadn't been touched in years. But as I was giving the room one last look, I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. On the wall behind where the wardrobe stood, I spotted a dusty old mirror. It was large and oval-shaped, with an ornate silver frame that had tarnished with age. The glass was grimy, covered in a thick layer of dust that dulled its reflection. I approached it, drawn by a strange sense of curiosity. Why hadn't I ever noticed it? Had it always been there? I brushed my fingers across the mirror, wiping away some of the dust to see my reflection. But even after I wiped the glass, my image seemed strangely blurred. It was hard to explain, but something about my reflection didn't look quite right. It was as if my face was distorted slightly, elongated in places it shouldn't be. I chalked it up to the age of the glass or maybe the poor lighting in the room. That's when I first heard it, a faint creak from somewhere above me. My mind told me it was just the house settling, that familiar old sound I'd heard 1,000 times before. But somehow, it felt different that day, louder, more distinct. I froze, straining my ears. Silence. Then, just as I was about to shrug it off, I heard it again, louder this time, and unmistakably close. It sounded like footsteps. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was spooking myself for no reason. After all, the house was empty. But my heart was already racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was up there. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was moving carefully. My stomach twisted. I tried to calm myself, telling myself there was no logical reason for anyone to be here. But logic didn't do much to settle my fear. My phone was in my pocket, and I fumbled to pull it out, thinking maybe I'd call my parents. But just as I unlocked the screen, there was a sudden crash from upstairs, the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I just stood there, paralyzed with fear. I forced myself to move, backing away from the mirror and retreating into the far corner of the room. I couldn't bring myself to go upstairs, but I also couldn't tear my eyes away from the staircase, half expecting someone to come down any moment. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching out like an eternity. The house was quiet again, eerily so, as if holding its breath along with me. I began to wonder if maybe it was just some kind of accident. Maybe a window had fallen or something had shifted in the empty rooms upstairs. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I could still feel that sense of presence, lingering in the air like an unseen shadow. Suddenly, I heard a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor above me. I clutched my phone tighter, ready to call for help, but something held me back. I don't know if it was fear or a morbid curiosity, but I found myself rooted to the spot, listening. The sound grew louder, moving towards the stairs, then stopping just at the top, as if whatever was up there was hesitating. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just a figment of my imagination. And then I felt it, the subtle shift in the air, the sensation of being watched. I opened my eyes and turned slowly towards the window, and that's when I saw it, a dark figure standing just outside the glass, watching me. Its face was obscured, but I could make out a shadowy form, tall and thin, with long limbs pressed against the glass. My heart leapt into my throat, and I stifled a scream, backing away until I was pressed against the wall. I had no idea who or what it was, but the way it stood there, unmoving, was enough to send chills down my spine. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe it was just a neighbor, or someone passing by. But something about it didn't feel right, the way it stood so still, almost as if it were waiting. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. The rain had started to fall, pattering against the window and blurring my view of the yard outside. Just when I thought I might be losing my mind, there was a knock on the door, sharp and unexpected. My heart skipped a beat, and I took a hesitant step forward, peeking out the window to see one of our neighbors standing on the porch, holding an umbrella and looking slightly annoyed. "Oh, thank God," I muttered, feeling a wave of relief. I opened the door, and Mrs. Preston, our elderly neighbor, stood there, her face pale from the cold and rain. She seemed a little frazzled, glancing over her shoulder before looking back at me. "I've been looking everywhere for my cat," she said in her usual no-nonsense tone. "I swear, he's been hanging around your backyard for the past hour. Have you seen him?" I blinked, still a little disoriented from the panic I just felt. No, Mrs. Preston. I haven't seen him." She frowned, clearly not entirely convinced, but nodded anyway. "Well, if you do see him, let me know." With that, she turned and disappeared into the misty rain, leaving me standing in the doorway, heart still racing. I closed the door slowly and locked it, my mind still reeling. The strange figure at the window, was it real? Had I imagined it? It had felt so tangible, so close. But Mrs. Preston hadn't seen anyone on the porch, and her cat, well, I hadn't seen anything of it either. Maybe it was just my nerves getting the best of me. But as I turned away from the door, my gaze was drawn back to the mirror in the room. It still hung there on the wall, dusty and forgotten, its reflection catching the dim light from the hallway. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was as if it was waiting for me to look, like the mirror itself was alive. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus. I should check on the rest of the house, make sure everything was still secure. I started to move toward the stairs when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, louder this time, deliberate and slow. They were coming from upstairs. This time, there was no denying it. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was in the house. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps were almost too distinct now, heavy and deliberate, as if whoever was up there knew exactly what they were doing. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor. The air was thick with an oppressive feeling, like the house itself was holding its breath along with me. I reached for my phone again, but before I could even unlock it, I heard the front door creak open. A voice, muffled by the rain, called out, "Lily?" It was my dad. His voice, usually so calming, was now filled with uncertainty, almost as if he were calling to me from a distance I couldn't quite reach. I rushed down the hallway to meet him, my footsteps muffled on the carpet. "Dad!" I cried out, my voice shaky, barely above a whisper. "There's someone in the house." He looked at me, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean, someone in the house? We've been gone for hours. No one's here but you, Lily." I heard footsteps, I said, barely able to form the words. And then, "I saw someone outside the window." My dad's expression softened, but there was a hint of concern behind his eyes. "Okay, let's go upstairs and check it out." He was calm, too calm, and that only unsettled me more. But I nodded, following him as he led the way up the stairs. The house seemed even quieter now, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. Every little creak of the floorboards under our feet echoed through the house. When we reached the top of the stairs, my dad turned to me with a reassuring smile. "See? There's nothing up here. It's just the house settling. You've been under a lot of stress with the move." I didn't believe him. I didn't care what he said. The air was wrong, thick with a strange, suffocating presence. I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat, the weight of the moment making it hard to breathe. We checked every room upstairs, the bathroom, the guest room, even the small attic hatch that led up to an old storage space we hadn't opened in years. There was no sign of anyone. The house felt empty, just as it should have. But then we reached the last room, my old bedroom. The door was ajar, and I could see the faint outline of the mirror through the crack in the door. As we stepped inside, I immediately felt a sense of unease. The mirror was still there, but something had changed. The glass was shattered, the cracks spiderwebbing across its surface in a pattern that made my skin crawl. I didn't know how it had happened, but I was certain the mirror hadn't been broken when I last saw it. "What happened to the mirror?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. My dad stepped forward, inspecting the glass. "It must have fallen while you were moving things around," he said, trying to sound reassuring. But even he seemed a little rattled by the sight of it. He bent down to examine the shards more closely, his fingers brushing against the frame. I was about to say something when I saw it, a reflection in the shattered glass. It wasn't mine. It wasn't my dad's. It was a shape, just out of focus in the cracks, standing right behind us. My blood ran cold. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking. "Did you see that?" He looked up from the mirror, his face pale. "What?" "Someone was in the reflection," I whispered. "Right behind us." He froze, his expression shifting from concern to something else, something darker. He stood up slowly, his hand resting on the broken frame of the mirror. Before he could say anything, I asked, my voice trembling, "Why didn't you say anything when I told you about the footsteps?" My dad hesitated, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "Because when I came back inside just now," he said, his voice tight with unease, "I saw you standing at that window, looking down at me from upstairs. You were staring out, but something about it was off. Like you weren't really there." I felt my stomach drop. It didn't make sense. I'd been downstairs the entire time, with him. "That's not possible," I whispered. But I could see the fear in his eyes. We both knew something wasn't right. Something had happened in that house. Something beyond our understanding. And as we stood there, the rain tapping softly against the windows, I realized that the presence in the house, whatever it was, hadn't gone. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, watching us. And the memory of that day, the strange events we'd witnessed, would follow us for the rest of our lives. It was a cold night in the fall of 2009 when I first encountered something I still struggled to understand. I was 17 at the time, just another kid trying to figure out the world. School had let out late that day, and instead of taking the usual route home along the busy streets, I decided to cut through the old park at the edge of town. It was a habit of mine, mostly because the park felt safer, at least compared to the narrow, dimly lit sidewalks by the highway. The park wasn't anything special, just a few acres of trees and walking paths, with a couple of rusty swings and old benches scattered here and there. The kind of place people used to walk their dogs or maybe sit to smoke a cigarette if they wanted a moment of peace away from the world. But that night was different. I remember everything vividly, as if the events from that evening have been etched into my memory, burned into my brain. The air was heavy with the scent of wet leaves, and the path through the park was almost deserted. I could barely hear anything other than the distant hum of traffic from the main road and the occasional rustle of branches swaying in the wind. The park, usually full of life, was eerily quiet that evening. The few people who'd been walking earlier had already disappeared, their footsteps lost to the whisper of the trees. I'd been walking for about 10 minutes, my sneakers crunching against the gravel path when I noticed something odd up ahead, a bag. A large, dark duffel bag was sitting on one of the benches, its zipper half open as though someone had just left it there in a hurry. At first, I thought maybe it had been forgotten by a jogger or a careless passerby. But something about the bag, its abandonment, gave me an unsettling feeling. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the bag for a long moment. It didn't seem like it belonged. There was something about it that felt off, like it had no reason to be there. I looked around, hoping to spot whoever had left it behind, but the park remained empty, the only movement being the occasional flutter of a leaf from the trees. I thought about walking past, continuing my journey home, but a strange impulse made me hesitate. Maybe I was curious, or maybe I just didn't want to be one of those people who ignored something strange when they knew they shouldn't. I decided to wait. After all, if someone had left it behind, it was only polite to wait for them to return and reclaim it. I sat down on a bench nearby, trying to calm my racing thoughts, convincing myself it was nothing. 15 minutes passed, and no one showed up. The bag remained where it was, completely undisturbed. A part of me began to get anxious. I tried to tell myself it was just my overactive imagination. Maybe someone had just dropped it on purpose and walked away. But another part of me couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Another 5 minutes went by, and I decided enough was enough. I stood up from the bench and began walking again, telling myself I was being foolish. But as I made my way toward the end of the park, something caught my attention, a sound. At first, it was faint, barely audible, like a low growl or the wind passing through the branches. But as I kept walking, the sound grew louder. I paused, my heart suddenly thumping in my chest. The noise, it was coming from somewhere nearby, but I couldn't pinpoint where. I squinted into the shadows ahead, trying to make out anything unusual. That's when I saw it, a shape, large and dark, standing in the middle of the path. At first, I thought it was just another tree or maybe a trick of the light, but as I stared, I realized it was moving. Slowly. The shape seemed to shift, like a massive, hulking creature, its form indistinct and blending into the darkness. My stomach twisted into knots. I had no idea what it was, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to find out. I took a step back, my body tense, and that's when I heard it. A rustling sound behind me, soft at first, but then unmistakably closer. My pulse raced as I turned around, my eyes darting between the path ahead and the one behind me. That's when I saw them, two shapes, moving steadily toward me, one on each side of the path. The figures were barely visible, just dark silhouettes, but there was no mistaking their movement. They weren't human. They were too large, too fluid in their motion. They didn't make any noise as they approached, their steps unnervingly silent, as if they were part of the night itself. I couldn't breathe. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground, and I couldn't decide if I should run or stay still. My mind was screaming at me to move, but my body refused to cooperate. The creature in front of me, the one that had been blocking my way, shifted again, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw its eyes, two glowing spots of yellow light, piercing through the darkness, staring right at me. It was then that I realized what I was dealing with wasn't any wild animal or figment of my imagination. These creatures were real. And they were hunting me. The panic set in, coursing through my veins like ice water. My legs finally found the strength to move, and I turned, running without thinking. My breath was ragged in my chest, each step heavy as I desperately tried to make my way toward the park's exit. But the creatures were still behind me. I could hear them, the faint scraping of claws against the gravel, the shifting of their bodies as they kept pace with me. I didn't dare look back, my mind too focused on getting out, on getting to safety. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, when my legs felt like they were going to give out, I felt the first drop of rain fall from the sky, a cold, sudden splash on my face. Then another. And another. The rain began to pour down in sheets, heavy and relentless. The creatures seemed to falter, their movements slowing as the rain began to drench them. The sound of their footsteps became more sporadic, their forms less defined in the downpour. With one last, desperate glance over my shoulder, I saw them retreat into the trees, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. I didn't stop running until I was safely outside the park, my lungs burning, my heart still racing. I looked back at the park, but there was no sign of them. No movement, no shapes lurking in the shadows. The rain continued to fall, washing away the fear and the mystery of what had happened, or at least that's what I tried to tell myself. I had escaped. I was safe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. That something was still out there. And that I had barely escaped it. It took me months before I could even think about walking through that park again. The memories of that night haunted me, every shadow a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a reminder of what I'd narrowly survived. It was Halloween night, and I was working the late shift at a small coffee shop in downtown Portland. The place was always quiet, a little too quiet at times, but I didn't mind. I loved Halloween. I loved the decorations, the eerie atmosphere that seemed to seep into the air with the crisp autumn breeze. This time of year was my favorite, hands down. I'd spent the last few hours getting into the spirit, setting out jack-o'-lanterns, hanging fake cobwebs, and playing spooky music on the store speakers. The usual crowd had come and gone, and I was preparing to close up when I realized something was off. It had been a long day, and I was exhausted. My manager, Greg, had given me the rundown earlier that afternoon. He'd set up a security camera system in the back room, complete with a bell to alert me if anything was out of the ordinary. "Just in case," he'd said with a grin. "Not that we ever get trouble around here, but you never know." I thought it was a bit overboard, but I wasn't going to argue. After all, it was Halloween, and people could get weird. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 11:30 p.m. Greg had left hours ago, and I was alone in the shop, the last customer long gone. I'd been trying to get the final touches done before locking up, but I'd already spent too much time on it. I still needed to get the keys from the storage room and start shutting down the machines. As I was walking past the counter to head toward the back, I noticed something strange through the window, a figure standing on the sidewalk, just past the entrance. They were dressed in a full-body cloak, black as night, with a hood pulled low over their face. The only thing visible were their hands, pale and claw-like, sticking out from the sleeves. At first, I thought it was just some weirdo getting into the Halloween spirit, probably a local going all out for a costume party. Maybe they were even on their way to the haunted house down the street. I didn't think too much of it. I grabbed the keys and headed to the back storage room. The wooden floors creaked under my boots as I walked, the cold draft from the back door brushing against my neck. It was then that I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible, like a muffled thud. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was probably just the wind. Maybe something had fallen over in the alley outside, or a trash can had tipped over in the breeze. But the sound came again. A little louder this time. I stood there, frozen in place, my eyes darting toward the hallway that led to the front door. I could hear the faint hum of the coffee machine in the background, the soft rustle of paper bags in the pantry. Everything felt unnaturally still. I swallowed hard and made my way back to the front of the store, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I glanced through the window again. The figure was still there, standing in the same spot, unmoving. That's when I felt it, this growing sense of unease, like something was wrong. Something wasn't right. I thought about calling Greg. I even reached for my phone but hesitated. He'd only just left, and he probably wouldn't pick up anyway. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I had this weird feeling, like I was being watched, and it made my skin crawl. I turned away from the window and was about to head back toward the storage room when I heard the front door creak open. My stomach dropped. I wasn't expecting any more customers, and the late hour meant the shop should have been completely empty by now. Hesitant, I slowly turned toward the door. That's when I saw the figure in the cloak step inside. My heart pounded in my chest. The door swung shut behind them with a soft click, and the figure stood in the middle of the room, silent. They didn't move. They didn't say anything. They just stood there, staring into the darkened cafe as if they belonged. I don't know what possessed me, but I immediately ducked into the storage room and hid behind one of the shelves. My breath came out in shallow gasps, and I pressed my hand to my mouth to stifle the sound. I could hear the footsteps, slow, deliberate, tapping lightly on the wooden floors. They were moving toward the counter. I dared to peek around the corner, just enough to see the figure standing at the register, their hands resting lightly on the countertop. I could barely make out any details beneath the cloak, just the vague outline of the figure's body. A moment passed before they turned and started walking toward the back of the cafe. Panic surged through me. I couldn't tell if they'd seen me or if they were just wandering around aimlessly. Either way, I wasn't taking any chances. I pressed my back against the shelf, praying they wouldn't hear the faintest rustle of my movements. There was a soft sound of something metallic scraping against the floor, and then the door to the back storage room creaked open. I froze. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't move. I could hear the faint shuffle of feet, followed by the soft click of the door closing again. The figure had passed right by the storage room, but I didn't dare look out. I stayed hidden, my heart racing in my chest, too terrified to make a sound. The minutes stretched on forever. I could hear the footsteps fading away, and I thought I might be in the clear. But then came the door again, creaking open, and I realized they hadn't left. They hadn't left at all. Instead, I heard the soft click of the door as it closed behind them. I felt a chill go through me. They were still in the shop. I waited, my body stiff with tension, hoping against hope that the figure would leave. But then I heard something else. The sound of the door handle turning, the soft rasp of the lock twisting. They were testing the locks. I couldn't believe it. I thought about calling the cops, but what could I say? A guy in a Halloween costume had walked in and decided to lock me in? Would they even believe me? What if I was overreacting? What if this was some weird Halloween prank? As if on cue, I heard the bell above the door chime again. The figure was moving. I held my breath, listening intently. There was a faint sound of the door opening, then a few steps. Then nothing. I waited for what felt like forever before slowly emerging from my hiding spot. I glanced around the store, trying to make sense of everything. There were no signs of a break-in. Nothing was missing. But my heart was still pounding in my chest. I needed to check the camera footage. I walked over to the monitor near the back, hands shaking as I pulled up the security footage. The video flickered to life, showing a view of the front door. At first, everything seemed normal. The figure had entered, walked to the counter, and stood there. But then it hit me. The person hadn't left. They hadn't left at all. They had simply walked out the door, but only to close it behind them. Then they'd opened it again, just enough to make me think they had gone, before stepping back inside. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. They were toying with me. They knew I was watching. They knew I was hiding, and they were making sure I stayed there, too scared to leave. I immediately rushed to the door, my hands trembling as I grabbed the keys. But before I could unlock it, the office door slammed shut behind me. It was loud enough to make me jump, and the figure must have heard it too, because the footsteps started moving again, much quicker this time. I don't know what happened after that. It felt like a blur. I managed to unlock the door, just barely. I stepped outside, and for a second, the world seemed to go quiet. The figure was gone, but I could still feel their presence. The next morning, I went back to check the security footage again, hoping that I had imagined the whole thing. But the footage confirmed what I had feared. The figure had disappeared into the shadows just as I had escaped, vanishing into the night like a ghost. I never found out who they were, or why they'd come to that coffee shop that night. But I never looked at Halloween the same way again. The memories still linger, haunting me. It was a Friday night when everything started. The kind of night where the air feels a little colder, the streetlights flicker just enough to make you think something's off, and the quiet is a little too loud. I was working my usual late shift at the pizzeria, doing what I've been doing for the last 3 years, delivering pizzas. You know, the kind of job where you don't think too much about it. It's easy, you get paid, you go home. That was the plan, anyway. My shift had been pretty standard, a few orders here and there, nothing too special. But then, right before I was about to clock out, I got a call. The kind of call you know you're gonna regret, but you can't say no to. The manager, a grumpy guy named Earl, looked up from the register with a scowl. "Hey kid," he grunted. "I need you to take this last delivery. It's a bit out of your way, but it's the last one of the night. You up for it?" I didn't even hesitate. I had to get out of there. The night had been dragging on, and I could already feel the weight of the empty streets calling me to just finish and head home. I should have said no, but I didn't. I grabbed the pizza box, punched the address into the GPS, and glanced at the screen. It was odd. The address was way out of my usual delivery route, deep in a part of town I wasn't familiar with. It was also marked as residential area, which, for me, didn't exactly sound promising. I could have asked Earl if it was safe. I could have even told him I wasn't feeling it. But I didn't. Instead, I threw my jacket on, grabbed the keys to the car, and headed out the back door. The cold hit me immediately, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe it was just the exhaustion, or maybe I was just imagining things. Either way, I shrugged it off. I took the highway, my tires humming against the asphalt, the moon barely visible through the clouds. After a while, the city lights faded into the distance, and I found myself driving down dark, empty streets. There were no other cars, no pedestrians. The only sounds were the low rumble of my engine and the occasional creak of the wheel as I turned down the unfamiliar roads. I finally reached the area I was supposed to deliver to, and the GPS led me down a side street that looked more like a back alley. The houses here were old, run-down, almost abandoned. It felt like one of those places you see in movies where the character pulls up to a creepy house at the end of the street. And yeah, that's exactly what it looked like, except this was real. The house I was supposed to deliver to was a dark, two-story place, with a porch that had a light that flickered like it might give out any second. The yard was overgrown, and there was a sense of neglect hanging in the air, like no one had lived there for a long time. I couldn't see any lights on inside, and there was this strange, uneasy silence. I pulled over to the curb and put the car in park, staring at the house. Something about it just didn't sit right. I mean, I'd been to some sketchy places in the city, but this was different. My gut was telling me to get out of there, but then I thought, it's just a pizza delivery. I'm here to do a job, not get involved in some horror movie situation. I grabbed the pizza box, took a deep breath, and walked toward the house. The front door was slightly ajar, like someone had just stepped inside but forgotten to close it. I knocked on the door, and it creaked open further. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding louder than it should have in the thick silence. "Delivery for a Mr. Johnson?" There was no response, so I pushed the door open a little more. The interior was dark, and there was an unsettling chill in the air. The wooden floor creaked under my weight as I stepped inside, looking around, but I couldn't see anyone. "Mr. Johnson?" I called again, a little more forcefully this time. I was starting to feel like an idiot, standing in a stranger's house with no one around. Maybe I should have turned back. And that's when I noticed something odd. Out the corner of my eye, there was a light coming from the backyard. A soft, pale light, flickering like a street lamp struggling to stay on. I froze. The light seemed to be coming from behind a large, rusted ice cream truck parked just behind the house, near an old, boarded-up garage. I didn't want to go over there. I didn't want to investigate any further. But curiosity got the better of me, and against every ounce of common sense, I found myself walking toward the truck. The eerie silence around me seemed to stretch on forever, the only sound my shoes crunching against the gravel as I neared the truck. When I rounded the corner, I saw him. There was a man standing behind the truck, almost as if he was waiting for something. At first, I thought it was just some random person, maybe a neighbor or a passerby, but then something about him didn't feel right. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, but his face was obscured by shadows. He didn't seem to be moving, and he didn't acknowledge me when I stopped. I should have run. I should have turned around and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I took a step closer. "Hey man," I called out, my voice shaky. "You know anything about Mr. Johnson?" "Nothing." He didn't even blink. I felt that strange, uneasy feeling again, the feeling that something wasn't right. I backed away, slowly, keeping my eyes on him. I kept telling myself it was fine. It had to be fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Without thinking, I turned around and headed back to my car. But when I looked over my shoulder, I saw something that made my heart stop. The ice cream truck wasn't just parked behind the house. It was following me. I got in my car and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The truck was still there, its headlights shining in the darkness, slowly creeping closer. It didn't make sense. What was going on? Was this some kind of joke? No, this wasn't a joke. I sped down the street, hoping to lose it, but no matter how fast I went, the truck stayed behind me. The sound of its engine was like a constant, oppressive hum, growing louder the further I drove. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. I finally decided to pull off the main road, stopping behind the old Blockbuster building. There was no one around, just me and the truck. I needed to figure out what the hell was going on. I sat there, the engine off, the silence weighing down on me. The truck's headlights shone through the back window, and I couldn't tell if it was just my imagination, but it seemed like the truck was getting closer, inch by inch. Then it stopped. The headlights flickered once, twice, then went dark. For a second, I thought I had lost it. I felt a small sense of relief, but that didn't last long. My relief was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, watching, but nothing happened. I was alone. For now. I pulled out and drove straight to the pizzeria, my hands still shaking. I wasn't thinking clearly. My mind was in a haze. But when I arrived, I knew I had to report it. The cops weren't helpful, though. They told me the house had been abandoned for years. It was a known spot for criminal activity, people using it as a hideout. They said I should have never gone there in the first place. I felt stupid. I should have listened to my gut. From that night on, I never took another late delivery like that. Never again. There are places in this world you're better off staying away from. And some jobs aren't worth the risk.